Hey there, Reddit explorers. Before we dive into today's shocking story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any of these jaw-dropping tales. If you enjoy the video, smash that like button, it really helps the channel grow. I always thought I was living the American dream. A beautiful wife, a son who was the spitting image of my father, a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs with a picket fence, and a golden retriever named Max. Life was perfect, or so I believed. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and this is the story of how my entire life collapsed in a single afternoon over a cup of coffee. I met Sarah during my final year of college. She was stunning, long auburn hair, emerald green eyes, and a smile that could light up the darkest room. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, and we were married 6 months later in a small ceremony surrounded by our closest friends and family. The first few years of our marriage were blissful. We both landed decent jobs, purchased our first home, and started planning for our future. Sarah worked as a marketing executive while I built my career as a financial advisor. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and most importantly, we were happy. When Sarah told me she was pregnant, I was overjoyed. I had always wanted to be a father, to pass down the lessons my own dad had taught me. 9 months later, our son Jacob was born. The moment I held him in my arms, I felt a connection I had never experienced before. He had my father's nose and Sarah's delicate features. At least, that's what everyone said, and I believed them. As Jacob grew, I poured everything into being the best father I could be. I coached his little league team, helped with science projects, and taught him how to fish just like my father had taught me. Every milestone, every achievement filled me with immense pride. His first steps, his first words, his first day of school, I was there for all of it, capturing each moment, building memories. By the time Jacob turned 12, he had grown into a bright, compassionate young man with a talent for mathematics and a passion for baseball, just like me. Or so I thought. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Jacob was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and Sarah and I were enjoying a rare, quiet moment together. We sat on our back porch, coffee in hand, watching Max chase squirrels around the yard. The conversation flowed easily as we discussed our plans for Jacob's upcoming birthday. "I can't believe he's turning 12 already," I said, smiling at the thought of how quickly time had passed. Sarah's response changed my life forever. "You know," she said, swirling her coffee absently, "I've been thinking it's about time I told you something." There was something in her tone that made my stomach tighten, a coldness I had never heard before. "What is it?" I asked, setting my mug down. Sarah looked at me, her green eyes devoid of the warmth I had known for over a decade. "Jacob isn't yours," she said matter-of-factly. "He never was." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "What are you talking about?" "Jacob isn't your biological son," she repeated, her voice unnervingly calm. "I thought you might have figured it out by now." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. My mind raced through 1,000 memories: Jacob's birth, his first smile, teaching him to ride a bike, staying up all night when he had the flu. How could he not be mine? "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He looks just like my dad, everyone says so." Sarah laughed then, a sound that would haunt me for months to come. It wasn't her usual laugh, it was cold, almost cruel. "That's just what people say when they can't see a resemblance," she replied. "They look for something, anything to connect the dots. Your father had a Roman nose, so do millions of other men, including Jacob's real father." "Who?" I demanded, my shock giving way to anger. "Who is his father?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee before answering, as if we were discussing nothing more important than the weather. "Remember Brian from my office? The one who got transferred to Chicago right before I found out I was pregnant, Brian." I remembered him vaguely, tall, athletic, always flirting with Sarah at company functions. I had never liked him, but I had trusted my wife. "You had an affair with Brian." My voice cracked as the implications sank in. "It wasn't an affair, Thomas, it was just sex," Sarah corrected me, as if that distinction mattered. "It happened a few times when you were on that business trip to Boston. I never meant for it to happen, but it did. And then I found out I was pregnant. And you let me believe Jacob was mine for 12 years. I was shouting now, unable to control the rage and pain coursing through me. 12 years, Sarah," she shrugged, and that casual gesture broke something inside me. You were the better financial prospect, she said, as if it were the most logical explanation in the world. Brian was fun, but he wasn't husband or father material. You were stable, responsible, and you wanted a family. It seemed like the perfect solution. Perfect solution, I echoed in disbelief. You've been lying to me, to Jacob, for our entire marriage. Don't be so dramatic, Thomas, Sarah sighed. Lots of men raise children who aren't biologically theirs. What difference does it make? You love Jacob, don't you? Of course I loved Jacob. He was my son in every way that mattered, but that wasn't the point. Why are you telling me this now? I demanded, struggling to make sense of her revelation and her callous attitude. Sarah's expression changed then, becoming more calculated. Brian's back, she said simply. He moved back to town last month. We've been talking, and he wants to be part of Jacob's life. He has rights, you know. I felt as if I'd been punched in the stomach. Not only had my wife cheated on me and lied about our son's paternity for over a decade, but now she was planning to introduce another man as Jacob's father. Does Jacob know? I asked, dreading the answer. Not yet, Sarah replied, but I'm planning to tell him soon. Brian thinks he should know the truth. Oh, now the truth matters. I snapped, my hands shaking with anger and shock. Sarah fixed me with a cold stare. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Thomas. Jacob is still your son in all the ways that count, but he deserves to know his real father. I stood up so abruptly that my chair tipped over backward. Max stopped chasing squirrels and looked up at the sudden noise. I need to go, I said, unable to bear looking at Sarah's face a moment longer. Where are you going? She asked, sounding annoyed rather than concerned. Anywhere but here, I replied, walking toward the house. Don't wait up. I spent that night driving aimlessly, trying to process what had happened. My entire life, my marriage, my family, my identity as Jacob's father had been built on a lie that Sarah had maintained for 12 years without a hint of remorse. I checked into a hotel the next morning, unable to face going home. I called in sick to work and turned off my phone, needing time to think. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a deep, visceral ache that seemed to permeate every cell in my body. What hurt the most wasn't just Sarah's betrayal, but the casual way she had revealed it, laughing at my shock as if my pain were somehow amusing to her. You were just better financially, she had said, reducing my 12 years of fatherhood to nothing more than a convenient financial arrangement. After 3 days of isolation, I knew I needed legal advice. I contacted Deanna Reynolds, one of the top divorce attorneys in the city. Her reputation for handling complex cases was well known, and my situation certainly qualified. Mr. Mitchell, Deanna said after I had explained my situation, I won't sugarcoat this. You're in for a difficult battle. The fact that you've been Jacob's father figure for 12 years works in your favor for seeking visitation or even shared custody, but there are complications when the biological father is now in the picture and wants involvement. I just want what's best for Jacob, I said, and I meant it. Despite the pain and betrayal, my love for him hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger in my determination to remain in his life. Then we'll focus on that, Deanna assured me. But first, I recommend getting a paternity test to confirm what your wife has told you. Sometimes, these revelations come from a place of malice rather than truth. Part of me hoped Sarah was lying about Jacob's paternity, that this was some elaborate, cruel joke, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. There had been too much calculated coldness in her confession. The hardest part was going home to see Jacob. When I finally returned to the house, he ran to greet me, his face lighting up with the smile that had brightened my days for 12 years. Dad, where were you? Mom said you had to go away for work, but you didn't say goodbye, he said, hugging me tightly. I hugged him back, fighting tears. Whatever happened between Sarah and me, Jacob was innocent in all of this. I'm sorry, buddy, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It was a last-minute thing, but I'm here now. Sarah watched our interaction from the doorway, her expression unreadable. When Jacob ran upstairs to get something he wanted to show me, she approached. We need to talk about how we're going to handle this, she said quietly. Brian wants to meet Jacob next weekend. Next weekend, I repeated incredulously. You can't just drop this bomb on him with no preparation. He needs time, Sarah. Professional help, maybe. This isn't like telling him Santa isn't real. You're about to turn his entire world upside down. Sarah's face hardened. Don't tell me how to handle my son, her son, not ours. The distinction cut deep. He's been our son for 12 years, I retorted. And I'm not going to let you traumatize him because you and Brian have suddenly decided honesty is important. Our argument was interrupted by Jacob bounding back down the stairs, eager to show me his latest science project. I pushed my anger aside and focused on him, treasuring these moments even more now that I knew how precarious my place in his life had become. Deanna had insisted on a paternity test, and as much as I dreaded confirmation of what I already believed to be true, I knew it was necessary. Getting Sarah to agree was another matter. "Why do we need a test when I've already told you the truth?" she demanded when I brought it up. "Because I need to know for certain," I replied. "And because it will be necessary for the legal proceedings." "What legal proceedings?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. "I'm filing for divorce, Sarah," I said, finally putting into words the decision I had made in the hotel room. "And I'm going to fight for my right to remain in Jacob's life." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, that I wasn't simply accepting her terms as I had so many times before in our marriage. "Fine," she said eventually, "but you're paying for it." The test results arrived 2 weeks later, confirming what Sarah had told me. Jacob was not my biological son. Seeing it in black and white, the clinical language stating the alleged father is excluded as the biological father of the tested child, made it real in a way that even Sarah's confession hadn't. I sat in my car outside the lab, holding the paper, allowing myself to grieve. Not for the loss of a biological connection I had never actually had, but for the loss of certainty, of the uncomplicated love and pride I had felt as Jacob's father. Sarah arranged for Jacob to meet Brian without consulting me. I only found out about it when Jacob mentioned it casually over dinner at my new apartment. "Mom says I'm meeting a friend of hers on Saturday," he said, pushing his spaghetti around his plate. "Someone named Brian who knew her before I was born." I struggled to maintain my composure. "Did she tell you anything else about him?" Jacob shrugged. "Just that he's important and I should be nice to him." "Is he your friend too, Dad?" The innocence of his question broke my heart. "No, buddy, he's not my friend, but if your mom wants you to meet him, then you should." "Will you come too?" Jacob asked, looking up at me with trust in his eyes. "I don't think I'm invited," I said carefully, "but you can call me anytime if you want to talk, okay?" I contacted Diana immediately after Jacob left, furious that Sarah had arranged this meeting without proper preparation for Jacob. Diana promised to address it in our temporary custody agreement negotiations, but it was too late to stop the meeting without creating more confusion for Jacob. Saturday came, and I spent the day in agony, imagining Jacob meeting the man who was his biological father while still having no idea of their connection. I wondered what Brian was like, whether he would be kind to Jacob, whether Jacob would see any of himself in this stranger. When Jacob called that evening, he sounded subdued. "How was your day, buddy?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Weird," Jacob replied. "Mom's friend Brian kept staring at me and asking me all these questions about school and baseball and stuff, and then he and Mom kept whispering and they both looked at me funny. I didn't like it." I closed my eyes, relieved that Sarah hadn't dropped the paternity bomb yet, but angry at the confusing situation they had put Jacob in. "I'm sorry it was weird," I said, "but I'm glad you called. Want to tell me about your game yesterday? I'm sorry I missed it." Jacob's voice brightened as he described his baseball team's victory, and for a few minutes, everything felt normal again. The following week, my lawyer and Sarah's negotiated temporary custody arrangements while our divorce proceedings moved forward. I would have Jacob every other weekend and 2 evenings during the week. It was less than I wanted, but more than Sarah had initially offered. Brian's presence complicated everything. He had hired his own lawyer and was seeking legal recognition as Jacob's father, which would give him rights that could potentially supersede mine as a non-biological parent who was not officially adopting. The legal battle was just beginning when Sarah decided to tell Jacob the truth without warning me first. I received a frantic call from Jacob on a Tuesday evening. He was sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. "Jacob, slow down," I said, panic rising in my chest. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Mom says," he hiccuped through tears, "Mom says you're not my real dad. She says Brian is my biological father, and you've known all along I wasn't yours. Is that true? Have you been lying to me my whole life?" The accusation blindsided me. Not only had Sarah told Jacob about his paternity without preparation or support, but she had also apparently twisted the narrative to make it seem as if I had been complicit in the deception. "Jacob, listen to me," I said firmly, despite my racing heart. "I need you to take a deep breath. Can you do that for me?" I heard him trying to control his breathing. "Good, now listen carefully. I only found out about this recently. I had no idea before then. I've always thought of myself as your dad because that's what I've been from the day you were born. Nothing has changed about how I feel about you. You are my son in every way that matters. But we're not related," Jacob said, his voice small and hurt. "We don't have the same blood." "Family isn't just about blood, Jacob," I said, wishing desperately that I could hold him, shield him from this pain. "It's about love and commitment and showing up for each other, and I have always loved you and always will, no matter what." There was a pause, filled only with Jacob sniffling. "Mom says I have to start spending time with Brian because he's my real father," he finally said, "but I don't want to. I don't even know him." "What do you want, buddy?" I asked gently. "I want things to go back to normal," he whispered. "I want you to come home." My heart shattered all over again. "I know, Jacob. I wish I could make that happen. But even though things are changing, my love for you isn't one of those changes. You understand that, right?" Before Jacob could answer, I heard Sarah's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. Then the call ended abruptly. I tried calling back immediately, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I texted Sarah, demanding to know what she had told Jacob and why she had chosen to do it without any preparation, but received no response. In a panic, I drove to Sarah's house, determined to see Jacob and make sure he was okay. When I arrived, Brian's car was in the driveway. The sight of it parked where my car had been for 12 years felt like another violation. I rang the doorbell, prepared for a confrontation. Sarah answered, her expression cold. "You can't just show up here unannounced," she said, blocking the doorway. "Jacob called me hysterical," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Sarah said simply. "That you're not his biological father, that Brian is, that we've decided it's best for him to build a relationship with his real father." "And did you also tell him that I've known all along?" I asked, my anger barely contained. "Because that's what he thinks, Sarah. He thinks I've been lying to him his entire life." Something flickered across Sarah's face, guilt, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced with defiance. "It's better this way," she insisted. "A clean break. Brian has rights, and the sooner Jacob accepts that, the easier this will be for everyone." "Easier for whom?" I demanded. "Certainly not for Jacob, who's upstairs crying because his entire world has been turned upside down without warning or support." "He's my son," Sarah hissed. "I know what's best for him." "Let me see him," I said, trying to step past her. "No," Sarah blocked my way more firmly. "He's confused right now. Seeing you will only make it worse." "Sarah's right," a male voice said from behind her. Brian stepped into view, placing a proprietary hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Jacob needs time to process this without conflicting messages." I stared at the man who had fathered my son, a stranger who now presumed to know what was best for him. The rage I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. "You don't know the first thing about Jacob," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You haven't been there for his nightmares, his first day of school, his championship game. You don't know that he sleeps with his window open even in winter, or that he's allergic to strawberries, or that he's terrified of disappointing people he cares about. I've been his father in every way that counts for 12 years, and you don't get to waltz in and take that away." "Thomas," Sarah said warningly, "don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," I replied, my voice breaking despite my efforts to remain composed. "I'm fighting for my son." "He's not your son," Brian said, his tone maddeningly calm. "The test proved that." Before I could respond, a small voice came from the stairs behind them. "Dad, All three of us turned to see Jacob standing there, his eyes red from crying, his face pale. "Jacob," I said, relief washing over me at the sight of him. "Are you okay?" He ignored Sarah and Brian, pushing past them to throw his arms around me. I held him tightly, feeling his small body shaking with suppressed sobs. "I want to go with you," he whispered against my shirt. Sarah stepped forward, her face tight with anger. "Jacob, go to your room." "Your father and I need to talk." Jacob clung to me more tightly. "You said he's not my father," he said, his voice muffled against my chest. "So why should I listen to you?" The hurt and confusion in his voice broke my heart all over again. This was exactly the kind of emotional damage I had feared. "Jacob, please," Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. "This is complicated and we're trying to do what's best for you." "Then let me stay with Dad tonight," Jacob pleaded, looking up at me with desperate eyes. "Please." I looked at Sarah, silently daring her to refuse in the face of Jacob's obvious distress. She hesitated and Brian placed a hand on her arm. "Let him go," he said quietly. "It might be better to give him some space." I was surprised by Brian's intervention, but grateful for it. Sarah reluctantly nodded. "Fine," she said tightly, "but I expect him back tomorrow after school." Jacob ran upstairs to pack an overnight bag, leaving me alone with Sarah and Brian in an uncomfortable silence. "This isn't over," Sarah said once Jacob was out of earshot. "Brian is his father, and the sooner you accept that, the better for everyone." "Biology isn't everything," I replied evenly. "And I'm not going anywhere, Sarah, not as long as Jacob wants me in his life." When Jacob returned with his backpack, Sarah tried to hug him goodbye, but he shied away from her touch. The hurt in her eyes was palpable, but for once I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for her. She had brought this on herself with her callous handling of a delicate situation. As we walked to my car, Jacob reached for my hand, something he hadn't done in years, considering himself too grown up for such gestures. I squeezed his hand gently, a silent promise that I would be there for him, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The following months were a blur of legal meetings, court appearances, and emotional conversations with Jacob. Deanna fought fiercely for my rights as Jacob's psychological parent, arguing that severing our relationship would be detrimental to his well-being. Sarah and Brian countered with arguments about biological rights and the importance of Jacob knowing his real father. They painted me as an obstacle to this relationship, suggesting that my continued presence was confusing for Jacob. The judge assigned to our case, a thoughtful woman named Judge Rodriguez, listened carefully to all sides. She ordered a custody evaluation, which included interviews with all parties, including Jacob. The day Jacob was interviewed, he insisted I drive him to the court-appointed psychologist's office. "I'm going to tell them I want to live with you," he said determinedly as we drove. "I don't care what Mom says about Brian being my biological dad." "You're my real dad." "Jacob," I said carefully, "I appreciate that, but this isn't about picking sides. The judge wants to do what's best for you, and that might mean spending time with all the adults in your life." Jacob crossed his arms stubbornly. "I don't want to spend time with Brian. He keeps trying to act like he knows me, but he doesn't. Yesterday he bought me a basketball. I hate basketball." I suppressed a smile. Jacob had always been a baseball kid, showing no interest in basketball despite my attempts to introduce him to the sport. "Give him time," I said, surprised to find myself advocating for Brian. "He's trying to get to know you." Jacob looked at me with confusion. "Why aren't you mad at him? He's trying to take your place." I pulled into the parking lot and turned to face my son. "I'm not happy about the situation," I admitted, "but being angry won't help you, and that's what matters to me. Brian isn't a bad person for wanting to know his son. The way all this happened is wrong, but that's not his fault or yours." Jacob's lower lip trembled. "I just want things to go back to normal." I pulled him into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair. "I know, buddy. But sometimes life changes in ways we can't control. What we can control is how we respond to those changes." The custody evaluation report was largely favorable to my position. The psychologist noted Jacob's strong attachment to me and recommended that I retain significant parenting time regardless of biological connection. She also suggested a gradual approach to building Jacob's relationship with Brian, rather than the forced immersion Sarah had attempted. When the report was presented in court, Sarah was visibly displeased. Her testimony had portrayed me as controlling and Brian as Jacob's rightful father, but the evaluation contradicted this narrative. "Your Honor," her lawyer argued, "while we acknowledge Mr. Mitchell's role in Jacob's life, the fundamental right of a biological parent to raise their child cannot be overlooked. Mr. Carson," he nodded toward Brian, "has been denied the opportunity to parent his son for 12 years. He deserves the chance to establish a meaningful relationship without interference." Deanna countered forcefully. "What Mr. Carson deserves is irrelevant to what Jacob needs, Your Honor. The evaluation clearly shows that Jacob is suffering from anxiety and confusion since learning about his paternity. Reducing his time with the only father he has ever known would cause further psychological harm. Mr. Mitchell has been a consistent, loving presence in Jacob's life from birth. That relationship deserves legal protection." Judge Rodriguez considered both arguments thoughtfully. "This case presents complex questions about the nature of parenthood," she acknowledged. "While biology creates a legal presumption in Mr. Carson's favor, the psychological parent doctrine recognizes the importance of established parent-child bonds. I'll need time to consider my ruling." The waiting was excruciating. Jacob continued to split his time between my apartment and Sarah's house, where Brian was becoming an increasingly frequent presence. Sarah had softened her approach somewhat following the evaluation, perhaps realizing that her initial handling of the situation had backfired. 3 weeks after the hearing, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. To my surprise, it was Brian. "Thomas," he said, sounding uncomfortable. "I was hoping we could meet, just the two of us." I agreed with reluctance, arranging to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, Brian was already waiting, looking as awkward as I felt. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down across from him. "I know this situation is difficult." "That's an understatement," I replied dryly. Brian nodded, acknowledging the inadequacy of his words. "I want to talk about Jacob," he said after a moment. "What about him?" "He's unhappy," Brian stated simply. "Every time he's at Sarah's when I visit, he barely speaks to me. He locks himself in his room or asks to call you. Yesterday, he flat out told me he doesn't want me to be his father." I couldn't hide my surprise at Brian's candor. "What did you expect? That he'd welcome you with open arms after learning his entire life has been built on a lie?" Brian winced. "I didn't know, Thomas, about Jacob, I mean. Sarah never told me she was pregnant. I only found out when I moved back and ran into her at a conference. She showed me his picture and," he trailed off, looking genuinely distressed. "I would never have stayed away if I'd known I had a son." His words gave me pause. I had assumed Brian was complicit in Sarah's deception, or at least aware of Jacob's existence. The possibility that he had been kept in the dark as well changed my perception slightly. "Even so," I said, unwilling to let go of my resentment entirely, "you can't expect to walk into his life after 12 years and instantly be dad. That relationship has to be earned." "I know that now," Brian admitted. "I thought naively, I see, that there would be some kind of instinctive connection, but there isn't, not yet anyway." He looked down at his untouched coffee. "Sarah keeps pushing me to assert my rights, to demand more time with Jacob, but I'm starting to think that's not what's best for him." "What are you saying?" I asked cautiously. Brian met my gaze directly. "I'm saying that maybe we need to rethink this whole custody arrangement. Jacob clearly wants you in his life. Trying to replace you isn't working for any of us." I studied Brian's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only sincerity. "What do you propose?" I asked. "A compromise," Brian said. "I withdraw my petition for primary custody and acknowledge your role as Jacob's psychological parent. In return, I get regular visitation, but on Jacob's terms, no forced relationship, just the opportunity to get to know each other gradually." It was more reasonable than anything Sarah had proposed since the revelation. "Why the change of heart?" I couldn't help asking. Brian sighed heavily. "Yesterday, Jacob had a meltdown when Sarah told him he couldn't call you. He was sobbing, saying that everyone was trying to take his dad away. It hit me then. I'm not fighting for Jacob's best interests. I'm fighting for my right to be his father, but those aren't the same thing. For the first time, I felt a grudging respect for Brian. Have you discussed this with Sarah? Not yet, he admitted. She's determined that I should have a larger role in Jacob's life immediately. I'm not sure she'll agree. But you're Jacob's biological father, I pointed out, the irony not lost on me. Isn't that what matters most to her? Brian's expression was wry. Sarah has her own agenda. I'm starting to see that now. We parted with a tentative agreement to present a united front to both Sarah and the court. It was an alliance I never could have anticipated, but one that might ultimately be in Jacob's best interest. The day of Judge Rodriguez's ruling arrived with a tension that was palpable in the courtroom. Sarah sat rigidly beside her lawyer, occasionally glancing at Brian with confusion. Our conversation had clearly troubled her expectations. When Brian's lawyer announced their modified position, supporting my continued role as Jacob's legal parent with Brian having visitation rights, Sarah's face contorted with anger. She leaned over, whispering furiously to her attorney. Judge Rodriguez listened to the revised proposals with interest. This is an unexpected development, she noted. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand from your counsel that you object to this compromise. Sarah stood, her composure barely intact. Yes, Your Honor, Brian is Jacob's biological father. He has rights that should be recognized and prioritized. And Mr. Mitchell has been Jacob's father in every practical sense for 12 years, the judge countered. The custody evaluation indicates that maintaining that relationship is critical to Jacob's emotional well-being. But biology, Sarah began, is only one factor in determining a child's best interests, Judge Rodriguez interrupted firmly. This court must consider the totality of circumstances, including the child's established bonds and psychological health. The judge's ruling, when it came, was more favorable than I had dared to hope. I was granted legal status as Jacob's psychological parent with primary physical custody. Brian received generous visitation rights, but was ordered to work with a family therapist to build his relationship with Jacob at a pace comfortable for the boy. Sarah, whose manipulative behavior had been noted in the custody evaluation, received equal parenting time to mine, but was ordered to attend co-parenting therapy sessions. As we left the courtroom, Sarah approached me, her expression hard. This isn't over, she said quietly. Jacob belongs with me and his real father. Jacob belongs where he feels safe and loved, I replied. The court recognized that. You turned Brian against me, she accused. Made him doubt his rights as Jacob's father. I shook my head, tired of her manipulations. No, Sarah, you did that yourself when you treated Jacob's paternity like a weapon instead of a sensitive truth that needed careful handling. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You think you've won, but Jacob will figure out the truth eventually. Blood matters, Thomas, it always has. What matters is who shows up, I countered, who loves unconditionally, who puts Jacob's needs above their own. That's what makes a parent, Sarah, not DNA. She walked away without another word, her posture rigid with anger. I watched her go, feeling not triumph but a profound sadness for the family we might have been if honesty and compassion had guided her actions instead of selfishness and deception. The months that followed were challenging but healing. Jacob began therapy to process his feelings about his paternity and the dramatic changes in his family structure. Slowly, the anger he felt toward Sarah began to soften, though their relationship remained strained. To my surprise, Jacob gradually opened up to Brian as well. Their relationship developed cautiously, built on shared interests that emerged once the pressure of instant fatherhood was removed. Brian, true to his word, never tried to replace me in Jacob's life, but carved out his own place as a caring adult figure, something like an uncle at first, with the potential for a deeper bond in time. As for Sarah, the exposure of her deception and the loss of control over the narrative she had constructed changed her. The cold calculation I had glimpsed on that devastating afternoon gave way to moments of genuine remorse as she began to understand the consequences of her actions. One evening, nearly a year after her confession, Sarah appeared at my door without warning. Jacob was staying with Brian for the night, a new arrangement that had evolved naturally as their comfort with each other increased. "Can we talk?" she asked, her usual confidence notably absent. I invited her in, curious but wary. We sat in the living room, the space between us filled with unspoken recriminations and regrets. "Jacob seems happier," she began awkwardly. "When he's with me, he talks about the things you do together, about how you still help with his science projects and coach his baseball team." "That hasn't changed," I said simply. "I promised him it wouldn't." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands in her lap. "I handled everything wrong," she admitted quietly. "The way I told you, the way I told Jacob, trying to force a relationship with Brian, all of it." "Why did you tell me like that?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months finally finding voice. Laughing at my shock, treating 12 years of my life as if they meant nothing. Sarah's eyes welled with tears, genuine ones, not the calculated displays of emotion I had grown to recognize during our marriage. "I was terrified," she confessed. "When Brian came back to town and found out about Jacob, he was angry that I'd kept his son from him. I panicked, thinking I would lose everything, so I tried to take control of the narrative to make it seem like it had been my plan all along." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "I thought if I acted like it wasn't a big deal, maybe it wouldn't be. I was wrong." Her explanation didn't excuse her cruelty, but it made it comprehensible. "Fear makes people do terrible things sometimes. And Jacob," I pressed. "Why would you tell him without preparing him, without me there to help him process it?" "I thought it would be easier to rip the bandage off," Sarah said, her voice small. "Brian was pushing to meet him as his father, and I was afraid you would fight it if you knew in advance. I convinced myself it was better for Jacob to know quickly and move on." She shook her head. "The therapist says that was profoundly damaging for him, that I prioritized expedience over his emotional needs." "Yes," I agreed simply. There was no point in sugar-coating it. "I'm sorry, Thomas," Sarah said, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you both." I studied her face, searching for the manipulative woman who had laughed at my pain that day on the porch. Instead, I saw someone humbled by consequences, someone genuinely regretting her choices. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because Jacob needs us to find a way forward," she replied. "All of us, you, me, Brian. He loves you, Thomas. You're his dad in all the ways that matter. I was wrong to try to erase that." Her acknowledgement was unexpected and healing in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not enough to rebuild what had been broken, but perhaps enough to forge a new path forward, one centered on Jacob's needs rather than adult egos and agendas. "I can't forgive you yet," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to work with you and Brian to give Jacob the stability he deserves." Sarah nodded, accepting this limited olive branch. "That's all I'm asking for." As she left, I felt a weight lifting, not the entire burden of the past year, but a portion of it. The anger that had been my constant companion began to loosen its grip, making space for something else, hope for a future where Jacob could thrive despite the complicated truth of his origins. Jacob's 13th birthday arrived with spring, a milestone that felt particularly significant given the tumultuous year preceding it. By mutual agreement, we held a single celebration at a neutral location, a local park where Jacob could invite friends without the tension of navigating separate family events. I watched as Jacob opened gifts, surrounded by his friends and his unusual family configuration, me, his dad in every way but biology, Brian, his biological father still finding his place, and Sarah, learning to put Jacob's needs before her own desires. It wasn't the family any of us had envisioned, but it was working, slowly and with occasional setbacks. After the party, as the other guests departed, Jacob approached me with an envelope in hand. "I made this for you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Inside was a handmade card, painstakingly decorated with baseball imagery and photographs of us together through the years. The message inside brought tears to my eyes. "Dad, this year I learned that family isn't just about DNA. It's about who shows up, who listens, who loves you no matter what. You've always been there for me, and that makes you my real dad forever. Thank you for not leaving when things got hard. I love you." Jacob, I pulled him into a tight hug, overwhelmed by emotion. I love you too, buddy, I managed to say past the lump in my throat. Always have, always will. Over Jacob's shoulder, I caught Sarah watching us, a bittersweet smile on her face. Next to her stood Brian, his expression thoughtful as he witnessed the bond that 12 years of fatherhood had created, a bond that no DNA test could diminish or replicate. In that moment, the truth that had been revealed in such a cruel way a year earlier lost some of its power to hurt. Jacob wasn't biologically mine, but he was my son in all the ways that truly mattered. The lie had been shattered, but the love remained, stronger for having been tested and found genuine. The path forward wouldn't always be smooth. There would be challenges as Jacob navigated adolescence with his complicated family. Brian would continue to find his place in Jacob's life. Sarah would need to earn back trust through consistent actions rather than words. And I would need to find the balance between protecting my relationship with Jacob and allowing room for these other connections to grow. But on that spring afternoon, watching Jacob laugh with his friends, I knew that we would find our way through. Because while the truth about Jacob's paternity had changed many things, it hadn't changed the most important truth of all, that being a father isn't about whose genes you share, but about who you choose to be for your child every single day. It's about showing up. It's about putting their needs before your ego. It's about loving unconditionally, even when that love is tested by painful revelations or complicated circumstances. Sarah's casual words from that devastating day, "You were just better financially," had reduced my fatherhood to a mere financial arrangement. But Jacob's birthday card reframed it as what it truly was, a relationship built on thousands of small moments, countless acts of love and care, and a choice renewed each day to be the father he deserved. He wasn't my child by blood, he never was, but in every way that truly matters he was, is, and always will be my son. And that truth, unlike the lie that preceded it, is one I can build a life around.